They gave me a yellow plastic chair, not a broken one, not a folding chair they ran out of. A child's chair, the kind you find in a kindergarten classroom, set at the end of the long mahogany table where 43 members of the Parker family sat on cushioned seats with their names on little ivory cards. My name was not on a card. My name was on a piece of tape pressed to the back of that yellow chair. I sat down. I did not make a scene. I smoothed my dress, set my bag under the seat, and looked straight ahead. What Sandra did not know, what none of them knew, was that the one person in that room they had all spent 30 years trying to impress had come that afternoon for one reason. Me. My name is Allison Parker. I am 32 years old. And before that dinner was over, my grandfather stood up, took the microphone, and said my name in a voice that made the whole yard go still. Before I tell you what happened next, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And hit like and subscribe if you've ever been made to feel invisible by the very people who were supposed to claim you. I did not grow up believing I was unwanted. That came later, slowly, the way water damage works. You don't see it until the wall caves in. My father, Robert Parker, was the oldest of 4 siblings. He married my mother Claire in 1991 in a small ceremony that his family attended but never fully approved of. Claire was a schoolteacher from Ohio, no family money, no connections. No last name that meant anything at country club dinners. His siblings, Sandra, Mark, and Diane, were polite to her face for about 3 years. Then they stopped pretending. My father died when I was 9, pancreatic cancer, 14 weeks from diagnosis to gone. After the funeral, the Parker family closed around his absence, like a fist, and my mother and I were simply on the outside of it. There were no calls to check on us, no invitations to Thanksgiving for 2 years. When Grandpa Edward eventually insisted we be included again, we came. But we were always seated at the far end, always the last to be served, always the ones whose names got skipped when someone was making a toast. I learned to read a room early. I learned which cousin would be kind and which one was performing kindness for an audience. I learned that Sandra, my father's youngest sister, ran the family the way a stage manager runs a theater, deciding who had a speaking part and who stood in the background. I had a background part. Always. Brooke was Sandra's daughter, 2 years older than me, and she was everything the Parker family celebrated. Brooke had gone to Dartmouth on a partial scholarship that Sandra still described as full. Brooke worked in finance in Manhattan, in a role that sounded more senior every time Sandra mentioned it. Brooke had cheekbones and highlights, and a laugh that carried across a lawn, and she had learned from her mother exactly how to make you feel small without ever raising her voice. When we were teenagers, Brooke once told a table full of cousins that my mother bought my school clothes at Goodwill. She said it lightly, like a fun fact, smiling the whole time. I was 13. I did not say anything. I cut my green beans into very small pieces and stared at my plate until my face stopped burning. I got good at that, staring at something until my face stopped burning. What none of them tracked, in all those years of not tracking me, was what I was building. I left for Chicago at 18 with a partial scholarship to study architecture at the Illinois Institute of Technology. I waitressed 4 nights a week for 3 years. I graduated with honors. I joined a firm at 23, made junior partner at 28, and at 31 I opened my own practice, Parker Design Group, with 2 employees, then 6, then 11. By the spring of the year this story takes place, we had just completed a mixed-use development on the north side that was featured in Architectural Digest. Sandra did not know about Architectural Digest. Neither did Brooke. My mother knew, and she kept the magazine on her kitchen table until the pages softened at the corners. My grandfather knew too. He had called me the morning the issue came out. That was the thing about Grandpa Edward that the rest of the family seemed to forget, or perhaps never noticed. He paid attention. Not loudly, not the way Sandra paid attention, cataloging everything for later use, but quietly, steadily, the way a man pays attention when he actually cares about the answer. Edward Parker was 81 years old that summer. He had built the original Parker family business, a regional construction and land development company, from a single truck and a handshake loan in 1967. He had sold the operating company in 2004, but retained all the real estate, Parker Manor in Connecticut, 4 commercial properties in Hartford, and a land holding in Vermont that had tripled in value when a resort developer came calling in 2019. He was sharp, and he was quiet, and he moved through family gatherings like a man who had already decided what he thought of everyone in the room and saw no reason to revise. He had always stopped to talk to me, Not about grades, not about what I was wearing, not about whether I had a boyfriend. He asked about buildings. He asked what I found interesting about a structure, what problems I liked to solve. When I was 22 and home for Christmas, he pulled me aside after dinner and asked me to explain cantilever design in plain English. I talked for 40 minutes. He listened to every word. I thought about that conversation a lot in the years that followed. I thought about the way he looked at me, not like I was performing for him, but like he was genuinely filing the information away, like it mattered. I did not know then what he was filing it away for. I know now. The Parker family reunion was held every 3 years at Parker Manor, and the summer I turned 32, Sandra organized it, with the focus and intensity of a military operation, 240 RSVPs, a catering company from New Haven. White tents on the back lawn, fairy lights in the oak trees, a bartender who made something called a Parker Punch that tasted like lemonade and regret. Sandra called me in April to confirm I was coming. Of course, I said. Wonderful, she said, in the tone she used when she meant the opposite. I drove up from the city on a Friday afternoon in late July, windows down, the Connecticut hills green and thick on either side of the highway. I had a room booked at a bed and breakfast 4 miles from the manor, because Sandra had assigned the guest rooms to Brooke, Brooke's boyfriend, Mark's family, and Diane's family, and had texted me 3 weeks before the event to let me know there was no space left, so sorry, I had replied. No problem at all, I wore a navy wrap dress to the reunion. I had my hair down. I drove through the iron gates of Parker Manor at 11 in the morning, parked my car on the gravel, and walked up the stone path the way I always had. Shoulders straight, pace even, face neutral, Sandra met me at the door. She looked at my dress for just a half-second too long, the way she always did running a quick audit. Allison. You made it? I did, I said. She handed me a name card. Not the ivory kind. A piece of folded cardstock, my name written in blue ballpoint. I looked at it for a moment. Then I followed her around to the back lawn where the tables were set up. I found my seat at the far end of the long table, and there it was. Yellow plastic, 4 legs, sized for a 6-year-old, with a strip of masking tape on the back that said Allison in Sandra's handwriting. I stood there for 3 seconds. Then I sat down, set my bag underneath, smoothed my dress, and looked out at the oak trees at the edge of the lawn. 40 feet away, at the other end of the table, Grandpa Edward caught my eye. He did not smile. He just looked at me steadily, the way he always did, and gave one slow nod. I understood, not yet. But soon the thing about public humiliation is that it has a rhythm. It does not arrive all at once. It builds in layers, each one small enough that you could almost talk yourself out of calling it what it is. A seating arrangement, a tone of voice, a laugh that lasts just a half-second too long. By the time you have collected enough layers to name the thing clearly, you are already in the middle of it, and everyone around you has already decided whether they are going to say something or pretend not to notice. The Parker family, as a rule, pretended not to notice. The reunion started at 11 with mimosas on the lawn. I carried my yellow chair to the edge of the table and sat with my back to the manor so I could see the full yard. The white tents, the oak trees, the cousins I recognized, and the ones I had to study for a moment before the name came back. My cousin Daniel from Mark's side caught my eye and gave me a small, uncomfortable wave. He looked at my chair and then looked away. That was the closest anyone came to acknowledging it for the first 2 hours. Sandra moved through the party like a hostess who had rehearsed every moment. She had printed a program, an actual printed program, cardstock, Parker family crest at the top, with a schedule of the afternoon's events. Welcome remarks, lunch, family photo, Grandpa Edward's address, dessert. Sandra had listed herself as master of ceremonies. She had not listed Brooke, because Brooke's role did not need to be listed. Brooke was simply everywhere, laughing, touching arms, filling glasses, performing the kind of effortless warmth that takes a great deal of effort. I watched Brooke work the lawn for 20 minutes before she made her way to me. She came around the far end of the table, a glass of champagne in one hand, wearing a white sundress that probably cost $400 and was designed to look like it cost nothing. She stopped in front of me and looked down, which required barely any adjustment, given the height of my chair. Allison, she smiled. You look great. Very relaxed, thank you, I said. She glanced at the chair. The corner of her mouth moved, not enough to be called a smirk. Just enough. Mom wasn't sure if you were coming, she said. We almost didn't save you a spot. I'm glad she did, I said. Brooke looked at me for a moment longer, waiting, I think, for something she could use. When I didn't give her anything, she tilted her head in that particular way she had. part sympathy, part satisfaction, and moved on down the lawn. I picked up my water glass and took a slow drink. Lunch was served buffet style from long tables under the white tents. Sandra had arranged for the family to approach by table section, which meant the far end, my end, went last. By the time I reached the buffet, the salmon was mostly picked over, and the good bread Ed was gone. I took what was left and carried it back to my yellow chair and ate without complaint. Across the table, Sandra was holding court for a cluster of aunts and cousins. I could not hear everything, but I heard the cadence, that particular rise and fall of Sandra's voice when she was making something sound like casual conversation while actually making a point. I caught fragments. Parker legacy, responsible stewardship. Someone who truly understands what this family has built. She did not look at me once. Brooke refilled people's glasses. She stopped at every seat on the main section of the table. She did not come to my end. I was watching the oak trees at the far edge of the lawn when Grandpa Edward made his way over to me. He walked slowly. He used a cane now, a dark wood one he'd had since his hip surgery 2 years ago, and he lowered himself into the empty mahogany chair beside me without asking anyone's permission. He sat for a moment, looking out at the yard the same way I was. "Nice day," he said. "Beautiful," I said. He looked at my chair. He didn't say anything about it. He just made a small sound in his throat, the kind that meant he had seen it, catalogued it, and added it to a file he'd been keeping for a long time. "Gerald is coming at 3, he said quietly. Gerald Holt, the family attorney. I had met him once 8 months ago, in a different context entirely. "I know," I said. "Sandra thinks he's coming to finalize the trust distribution framework." He paused. "She's been calling his office every week for 6 months. I looked at him. "She doesn't know about the amendment," he said. "No," I agreed. He nodded. He put one hand over mine on the armrest of my small yellow chair, briefly, the way he had done when I was 9 years old and standing at my father's graveside. Then he stood, straightened, and walked back up the lawn toward the manor without looking back. I sat very still. The catering staff began clearing the lunch plates. A cousin's toddler ran past me, shrieking with joy at something invisible. Somewhere behind me, I heard Sandra's voice lift above the party noise, organizing, directing, narrating, the unelected CEO of everything. I reached into my bag and found my phone. I pulled up the message thread with Gerald Holt's assistant and typed, "Confirmed for 3 p.m. Mainlawn." The reply came in under a minute. "We'll be there." I set the phone face down on my knee. It was 12:47. I had 2 hours and 13 minutes. I picked up the last of my bread roll and finished it. Around me, the Parker family reunion continued exactly as it always had. The same conversations performed by different people, the same hierarchy observed, the same invisible lines held. Brooke was photographing the table setup with her phone, all artful angles and golden hour light, even though it was the middle of the afternoon. Sandra was laughing at something Mark said, her head thrown back, her hand on his arm. Nobody was looking at me. That was fine. They would be looking at me soon enough. The afternoon settled into that particular stillness that comes before something breaks. I recognized it the way you recognize the pressure change before a storm. Not from the sky, but from the way sound behaves differently, the way people move with a kind of unconscious urgency, like they can feel something coming without knowing what it is. The catering staff moved faster. The bartender wiped the same section of his table 3 times. Even the toddler, who had been shrieking through the lawn, went quiet and pressed his face into his mother's leg. Sandra felt it too, I think, but she misread it. She thought it was anticipation for her moment. At 1:30, she tapped a butter knife against a crystal glass and called everyone's attention to the center of the lawn. She had changed out of her morning outfit into a cream blazer that she had clearly been saving for this portion of the day. She stood with the easy authority of someone who had never once questioned whether the room belonged to her. "I want to take a moment," she said, before Grandpa Edward's remarks this afternoon, "to talk about what this family means." She spoke for 11 minutes. I counted. She talked about legacy, about the Parker name, about the responsibility of those who carry it forward. She talked about her own work, preserving the family's social connections, organizing these reunions, maintaining the manor. She talked about Brooke, her accomplishments, her character, her deep understanding of what the Parker family represented. She did not say Brooke's name as a suggestion. She said it the way you say a conclusion you have already reached. Brooke stood slightly behind her mother's left shoulder, looking gracious and slightly surprised, performing the expression of someone who had not rehearsed this moment at all. I sat on my yellow chair and watched. When Sandra finished, the applause was warm. Mark led it. Diane followed. A dozen cousins clapped with the enthusiasm of people who had learned that applause was safer than silence. Nobody looked at my end of the table. After Sandra's remarks, the energy of the party shifted into something looser. The dessert tables had been uncovered. Someone put music on low. The children were released from any pretense of sitting still. I stood, finally, and walked to the dessert table. I took a small plate of strawberries and stood at the edge of the lawn near one of the oak trees. Where the shade was deep and cool, my cousin Daniel appeared beside me. He was 34, worked in urban planning in Boston, and had always existed in the Parker family the way I did, present but not central, noticed but not celebrated. He stood next to me without preamble and looked out at the lawn. That was something, he said quietly. I agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Brooke's already texted 3 people that Grandpa is naming her the primary trustee. I know, I said. He looked at me sideways. Something in my voice had caught his attention. Not what I said, but the steadiness of it, the absence of the bitterness he was probably expecting. You okay? He said. I'm good, Daniel, I said. I'm really good. He studied me for another moment, then looked back at the lawn. He ate a strawberry. I ate a strawberry. We stood in the shade of the oak tree, like 2 people waiting for a different movie to start. At 2:15, Sandra found me. She came across the lawn with the specific purposefulness she reserved for tasks she considered unpleasant but necessary. Chin up, smile in place, pace brisk. She stopped in front of me and dismissed Daniel with a look that she didn't bother making subtle. Daniel drifted away. I stayed where I was, Allison. She folded her hands in front of her. I want to talk to you before this afternoon's program. Of course, I said. Grandpa Edward's remarks today are going to be significant. She paused, selecting her words with the care of someone who wanted to appear kind while delivering a verdict. He's going to be talking about the family's future, about the trust, about stewardship. Another pause. I think you know that these are matters that involve people who have been more actively present in the family's affairs. I looked at her. I just want to make sure, she continued, that whatever is said this afternoon doesn't come as a surprise to you. Or cause any unnecessary upset. She tilted her head slightly. You've always been a bit sensitive, Allison. Like your mother. She said my mother's name the way she always had, not using it but implying it. A category, a limitation. I let a beat of silence pass. Thank you for thinking of me, Sandra, I said. She searched my face for something, hurt maybe, or the particular gratitude of someone who has just been managed. She didn't find either. Well, she said. She smoothed the front of her blazer. Grandpa will speak at 3. I'd appreciate it if you didn't make things complicated. I won't make things complicated, I said. That was true. I had no intention of making anything complicated. Gerald Holt had a very clear process, and it would proceed exactly as he and Grandpa Edward had designed it, calmly and legally, and in front of every witnesses Sandra had personally assembled on this lawn. She walked back toward the manor. I reached into my bag. The envelope was still there. Cream-colored, heavy stock. Gerald Holt's firm name embossed in the upper left corner. I had carried it with me for 6 weeks without opening it again, because I did not need to open it again. I had read it enough times to know every word. I put it back. At 2:40, I sent one text. Not to Gerald. His arrival was already confirmed. I sent it to my mother, who was at home in Ohio, who knew everything, who had been awake since 5 in the morning. It's almost time, I wrote. Her reply came in 30 seconds. Your father would be so proud of you, baby. So proud. I stood under the oak tree for another moment, looking out at the lawn, the white tents, the fairy lights not yet lit in the afternoon brightness, the long mahogany table with its ivory name cards, and at the far end, just barely visible, the yellow plastic chair with the strip of masking tape on its back. Then I walked back to my seat and I sat down. 2:58. Across the lawn, a black sedan pulled slowly through the iron gates. 8 months before the reunion, on a Wednesday in November, I drove to Connecticut in the rain. Grandpa Edward had called me himself, not through Sandra, not through the family group text that I was technically part of but rarely looked at. He called from his personal cell phone, which he had owned for 4 years and used exclusively to call people he actually wanted to speak to. The list was short. I knew I was on it, but he had never called me directly before. When I saw his name on my screen, I pulled my car to the side of the road before I answered. Allison, he said. Are you free Thursday? I can be, I said. Come to the manor, he said. Come in the morning. I'll have Margaret make lunch. Margaret was his housekeeper of 22 years. The fact that he mentioned her meant this was not a quick meeting. This was a real visit, the kind with food and time built in. "I'll be there," I said. I did not ask why. He did not explain. That was one of the things I had always respected about him. He did not perform reasons. He simply said what he needed and trusted you to show up. I drove up on Thursday morning. The November trees were bare, the manor grounds stripped down to their bones. The stone walls, the iron-frame fencing, the long gravel drive that always looked slightly too grand for a man as plain-spoken as Edward Parker. He was waiting on the front steps when I arrived, which surprised me. He was in a wool cardigan and dark trousers, his cane in his right hand, and he looked older than he had at Christmas. Not frail exactly, but reduced, the way very strong things look when they have spent a long time holding weight. We ate lunch in the small dining room, not the formal one. Margaret made chicken soup and sourdough and a lemon tart for dessert, and Grandpa Edward ate slowly and asked me about my current project, a mixed-use development in Chicago's North Side. 5 stories, residential above retail, a corner lot I had been designing around a heritage oak tree that the city had protected. "You're designing around the tree," he said. "The tree was there first," I said. He looked at me over his soup bowl. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise, exactly, but recognition. Like a word he had been searching for had just appeared. After lunch, Margaret cleared the table, and Grandpa Edward asked me to follow him to his study. It was a room I had been in twice in my life, once as a child, once at 19 when he had handed me an envelope with $2,000 cash and told me to use it for textbooks, no argument. The study smelled of old paper and lemon oil. The shelves were full. His desk was clear except for a manila folder and a glass of water. He sat behind the desk. I sat across from him. He did not preamble. "I've been watching this family for 81 years, he said. "And I have made a decision that I should have made sooner, and I want to explain it to you in person because you deserve an explanation in person." I sat very still. "When I built this company," he said, "I built it because I believed that what you create should outlast you. Not the money, not the name. What you actually create. The thing that stands up when you're not there to hold it." He looked at his hands on the desk. "I have been looking at the people in this family for 30 years, trying to find someone who understands that." He opened the manila folder. Inside was a document, dense with legal language, the kind of formatting that means everything has already been decided by people who get paid to make decisions permanent. I could see Gerald Holt's firm name at the top. I could see my name, Allison Marie Parker, in the second paragraph, and again in the fifth, and in the signature block near the bottom. "This is the amendment to my estate plan," he said. "I've been working on it with Gerald for 8 months. It names you as primary beneficiary of the Parker estate in its entirety, Parker Manor, the Hartford properties, the Vermont land holding, the remaining liquid assets in the family trust." He paused. "The total current valuation is $14.7 million. The room was very quiet. Outside, the November wind moved through the bare oak trees, and I could hear it through the old window glass, a low and constant sound like something breathing. "Grandpa," I said. My voice came out steady, which surprised me. "Let me finish," he said. Not unkind, just clear. He told me that he had watched Brooke for 15 years and found her to be, in his precise words, a person who values what things look like more than what they are. He told me he had watched Sandra manage the family with skill and self-interest in equal measure, and that he admired the skill and had run out of patience with the self-interest. He told me he had watched me for 32 years and had noticed, specifically, the following things: that I had built something real from nothing, that I had never asked him for anything beyond conversation, and that when I was 9 years old and standing at my father's grave in the rain, I had held my mother's hand and not cried until I thought no one was looking. "I was looking," he said. I did not say anything for a long moment. Then I said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" He was quiet. He looked at the folder on the desk. "I needed to know," he said finally, "who you were when there was nothing to gain. I needed to see you keep coming to Christmas when Sandra put you at the wrong table. I needed to see you keep calling me when nobody else did. I needed to see what you built when you thought nobody from this family paying attention." He looked up. "I was paying attention, Allison. I have always been paying attention." I looked at the document. He slid it across the desk. "I'm not asking you to do anything differently," he said. "I'm asking you to come to the reunion in July. Sit where they put you. Gerald will be there at 3 o'clock, and then it will be done." I looked at him for a long moment. At the wool cardigan, the dark wood cane leaning against the desk, the hands that had built everything in that folder from nothing. Okay, I said. Okay, he said. I cried in the car. Not immediately. I made it down the gravel drive and through the iron gates and about a quarter-mile down the county road before I had to pull over. I sat on the shoulder with the rain coming down and my hands on the wheel, and I cried the way you cry when something you did not know you had been waiting for finally arrives. I cried for about 4 minutes. Then I pulled back onto the road and drove home to Chicago. I had a building to finish, the black sedan parked along the gravel drive, and Gerald Holt did not get out, not yet. That was the plan. He would wait until Grandpa Edward called for him. Until then, he was simply a car by the gate, and nobody at the reunion had any reason to look twice at a car by the gate. Sandra had a valet service. There were 6 other vehicles lined up behind the manor. One more meant nothing. I watched the sedan from my yellow chair, and then I looked away and I kept my face exactly as it had been all afternoon. Neutral, present, unremarkable. The skill of being overlooked is that once you have practiced it long enough, you can use it deliberately. I had been practicing for 23 years. At 2:59, Sandra tapped her crystal glass again. If everyone could find their seats, she said, projecting across the lawn with the confidence of a woman who had never once worried about being heard. Grandpa Edward will be making his remarks shortly. There was a pleasant shuffling, dessert plates set down, children corralled, the low music cut off mid-song. The family arranged itself back around the long mahogany table with the ease of people returning to assigned positions they had never questioned. 43 people, ivory name cards, 1 yellow plastic chair. I sat. Grandpa Edward came down from the manor at 3:01, walking slowly with his cane on the stone path. Margaret held the door for him. He did not look at Sandra as he passed her. He did not look at Brooke. He came down the path and settled into the large chair at the head of the table that had been set up specifically for this moment. Slightly elevated, a small standing microphone in front of it that Sandra had rented from an AV company in Hartford. He did not speak immediately. He sat, and he looked out at the family, and the family looked back at him, and for a moment the whole lawn was quiet except for the oak trees. Sandra leaned toward Brooke and said something behind her hand. Brooke smoothed her dress and lifted her chin slightly. Ready. Then Sandra stood. Before Grandpa speaks, she said, smiling at the table. I want to say how meaningful it is to have everyone here. This family, she gestured broadly, is what Dad built. And I know that what he shares with us today is going to reflect everything he values about our legacy, our future, and the people who are ready to carry this family forward. She sat down. She was still smiling. Grandpa Edward looked at her for a moment. Then he looked down the table. I felt his gaze reach me before I saw it. I looked up. He was watching me with that same steady, unhurried attention he had always given me. He nodded once, barely a movement, just a settling of his chin, and looked back at the microphone. I'll get to my remarks, he said. But first, I'd like some coffee. There was a small ripple of laughter. Margaret appeared from the side of the tent with a cup, as though she had known exactly when he would ask. She set it in front of him. He thanked her by name, then Sandra happened. It started small. It always started small with Sandra. She waited until Grandpa Edward was looking at his coffee, and then she turned to the table and said, pleasantly, conversationally, loud enough for the nearest 20 people to hear. You know, I was thinking, after Dad's remarks, it might be wonderful for Brooke to say a few words. Given everything she's contributed, she looked at Brooke. Would you be comfortable with that, sweetheart? Brooke demurred beautifully, pressing one hand to her collarbone. Oh, I don't know, Mom. I think the family would love it, Sandra said, addressing the table now, building the consensus she wanted before anyone could think to question it. A few people nodded. Mark said, absolutely. Diane said, yes, of course. And then Sandra looked down the table, at me, a clean, deliberate look, the kind that contained an entire sentence. You see how this works. I picked up my water glass. What Sandra did not know, what she could not have known, because she had spent 30 years not paying attention to the right things, was that in the 6 weeks since Grandpa Edward had confirmed the plan, she had done 3 specific things that Gerald Holt had quietly documented at my grandfather's request. The first was a phone call Sandra had made to Gerald's office in June, during which she had asked, in careful language that she clearly believed was subtle, whether there was any way to clarify the existing trust structure before the reunion to ensure continuity of family stewardship. Gerald had noted the call, dated it, and added it to the file. The second was a conversation Sandra had with Mark, overheard by Margaret and relayed to Grandpa Edward, in which Sandra said that Allison's was not a real Parker, that I was Robert's daughter in name but had never invested in this family the way family requires. Margaret had written it down on a notepad and given it to Grandpa Edward the same evening. The third was the chair. Gerald had photographed it that morning when he arrived to confirm the setup. He had time-stamped the photograph and added it to the file. A yellow plastic child's chair with a strip of masking tape that said Allison at the end of the Parker family reunion table. Documentation of intent and character, he had said when he told me. Clean and clear, I had not asked him to do any of this. Grandpa Edward had. Now Sandra was looking at me with her clean, deliberate look, and I held her gaze and did not give her anything. Not discomfort, not defiance, not the small flinching acknowledgement she was looking for. Just a woman sitting in a yellow plastic chair, holding a water glass, waiting. She looked away first. Allison, it was Brooke, from 3 seats down, leaning forward with her elbows on the white tablecloth in a way Sandra would have corrected in anyone else. She had a particular tone she used with me, warm, slow, carefully kind, the tone of someone explaining something simple to someone who needs it explained. I just want to say, I'm really glad you made the drive up. It means a lot that you came. Thank you. Brooke, I said. It can't be easy, she said, being so far away from the family. Chicago is. Well, she smiled. It's a long way, it is, I said. Do you have people there? Friends, a community? She tilted her head. I always wonder if you get lonely. I looked at her. At the careful construction of the question, the concern that was actually inventory, checking whether I had anything, anyone, anything to lose. I have a good life in Chicago, I said. She nodded slowly, sympathetically, and leaned back. I set my water glass down and folded my hands in my lap. In the black sedan at the end of the gravel drive, Gerald Holt was reading documents I had already read. In the manor behind me, Margaret was washing the lunch dishes and waiting. At the head of the table, Grandpa Edward was drinking his coffee with the unhurried patience of a man who had already won and was simply waiting for the clock to confirm it. And down the table, Brooke leaned toward her mother and whispered something, and Sandra smiled. That smile. I had seen it my whole life. That particular smile that meant she had already decided how the story ended. She was not wrong that the story was ending today. She was wrong about everything else. At 3:15, Sandra decided she needed me in the kitchen. It was not phrased as a request. It was phrased the way Sandra phrased everything she did not want questioned, as a practical necessity, delivered in passing, with the assumption of compliance built into the sentence structure. She appeared at my shoulder while Grandpa Edward was still finishing his coffee, bent down slightly, and said in a low voice that managed to carry to the 4 nearest people, Allison, Margaret could use a hand bringing out the coffee service for the rest of the table. Would you mind? I looked up at her. Of course, I said. I stood from my yellow chair, which required less dignity than sitting in it had, which was something, and followed Sandra toward the manor. Behind me, I heard the table continue its noise, the low current of family conversation, Brooke's laugh surfacing above it once. In the kitchen, Margaret was standing at the counter with her hands folded and an expression that told me she had not asked for any help and had not been told I was coming. She looked at me. I looked at her. She sent you in here, Margaret said. It was not a question. She did. I said. Margaret made a sound that was not quite a word and turned back to the counter. There was a full coffee service already arranged on a tray. Cups, saucers, a carafe, a small pitcher of cream. It had been ready for 20 minutes. It did not need 2 people. It barely needed one. I leaned against the counter beside her and looked out the kitchen window at the back lawn. From this angle, I could see the side of the white tent, the edge of the long table, the tops of people's heads. I could see the black sedan still parked at the end of the gravel drive. He's still out there, I said. He'll know when, Margaret said. She had known about Gerald's visit for 6 weeks. Grandpa Edward had told her the morning after he told me. Not because he needed her operational support, but because Margaret had worked in that house for 22 years, and he believed she deserved to know. She had kept it with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else. Not a word to Sandra. Not a word to anyone. I picked up a dish towel that didn't need picking up and set it back down. You should go back out, Margaret said. Don't let her keep you in here. She wants me away from the table when Grandpa speaks, I said. I know what she wants. Margaret turned and looked at me steadily. She was 63, compact and precise. With gray hair she wore pinned up and a quality of attention that reminded me of my grandfather. She's been maneuvering this family for 30 years, and she has never once succeeded in maneuvering Edward. She paused. Don't give her the satisfaction of keeping you in this kitchen, I nodded. I picked up the coffee tray. I'll bring this out, I said, and then I'll sit back down. Margaret looked at the tray in my hands and then at me, and something in her face softened. Not pity, not sympathy exactly, but the particular warmth of a woman who has watched something unfair happen for a very long time and is about to watch it stop. Good girl, she said quietly. I carried the coffee tray out through the manor's back door and across the stone path to the tent. Sandra was back at the table, seated, speaking to Diane. She saw me emerge with the tray, and I watched the small calculation happen in her expression. Satisfaction that I had done the errand, mild surprise that I had come back so quickly. I set the tray on the side table near the tent opening. A cousin I barely knew thanked me. I walked back to my yellow chair and sat down. Grandpa Edward looked at me. I gave him a small nod. He set down his coffee cup. At 3:22, Sandra's phone buzzed on the table in front of her. She glanced at it, and whatever she saw made her posture sharpen almost imperceptibly. She leaned toward Brooke and said something. Brooke straightened. Mark, across the table, caught Sandra's eye and raised his eyebrows in a question. Sandra gave a tiny, satisfied nod. She thought the call was confirmation of something she had been expecting. I did not know what specifically. Perhaps Gerald's office confirming his arrival, which she would have interpreted as confirmation of the trust framework she believed he was here to execute. Whatever the message was, it settled her. She relaxed back into her chair with the ease of a woman who believes the next 30 minutes will go exactly as planned. I looked at my hands in my lap. I thought about what Sandra had said to Mark in this house 8 months ago, that I was not a real Parker. I had turned that sentence over many times since Margaret had relayed it, not because it hurt, or not only because it hurt, but because of how precisely it revealed Sandra's understanding of the word real. To her, real meant present at the right tables, connected to the right people, performing the right kind of belonging. It meant Brooke's Dartmouth degree and Manhattan apartment. It meant Sandra's organizing and coordinating and positioning. It meant the visible work of claiming a name. It did not mean driving 4 hours in November rain because your grandfather called. It did not mean sitting with a dying man and talking about buildings while everyone else was at a ski resort. It did not mean building something with your hands from nothing while the people who shared your last name did not ask how it was going. My father had been a real Parker. He had also been written out of the family's center of gravity within 3 years of marrying my mother. I thought about him sometimes in the context of this house, what he would have thought of what his family had become, what he would have thought of me sitting in a yellow plastic chair at the far end of the table. I thought he would have found it funny, actually. He had a dry, quiet sense of humor about the things people revealed when they thought they were in control. I think he would have liked Gerald Holt. At 3:29, I felt my phone buzz once in my bag. I did not take it out. I knew what it said. We had agreed on a one-buzz signal when Gerald was 30 seconds from the gate. I breathed in slowly through my nose. Across the table, Brooke was touching her hair, the small unconscious adjustment of someone who expects to be looked at shortly. Sandra had her hands folded on the table, composed, settled, certain. 43 members of the Parker family sat in the afternoon light under the white tent, the oak trees casting long shadows across the lawn now as the sun moved west. The fairy lights in the branches had not come on yet, but they would soon, little warm points appearing in the dusk that was still an hour away. I thought about the heritage oak tree in Chicago that I had designed a building around. How the architects before me had wanted to remove it. Cleaner, simpler, cheaper. How I had looked at that tree and seen the structure differently, built the plans around its presence instead of its absence. Some things, I had told my clients, you design around. Not because you have to. Because they were there first. At 3:31, I heard the gravel crunch. I did not look up immediately. I listened to the sound of it, deliberate footsteps, unhurried, a man who knew exactly where he was going and had no reason to rush. Then Sandra looked up. I watched her see him. Gerald Holt in his dark suit, cane leather briefcase in his left hand, walking across the lawn toward the tent with the calm authority of someone who has never once arrived at the wrong moment. Her expression did not change. Not yet. She thought she knew why he was here. She smiled at him across the lawn. He did not smile back, and I watched, In the half-second before Sandra's smile began to falter, I watched her understand, not the specifics, not yet, but the shape of something. The way you understand a word you cannot quite read from across the room. She knew the shape of it. She did not know what it said. Her eyes moved to me. I looked back at her steadily, and I did not look away. Brooke stood up at 3:33. Nobody asked her to. There was no cue, no signal, no moment in the program that Sandra had printed on cardstock that designated 3:33 as Brooke's time. But Brooke had spent her entire life reading rooms, for the moment, when attention was available and unclaimed, and she moved into this one the way she always moved into available space. Smoothly, with a smile, as though she had been invited. She picked up her champagne glass. "I hope nobody minds," she said, projecting across the table with the warm confidence of someone who has never seriously considered that someone might mind. I I feel like I need to say something. About this family. About what today means." Sandra looked up at her daughter with an expression of pure, uncomplicated love. The kind of love that does not question. The kind that has decided its object is exceptional and filters all subsequent evidence through that conclusion. Mark raised his glass. Diane followed. A ripple of readiness moved around the table. Grandpa Edward did not raise his glass. He set both hands flat on the table in front of him and looked at Brooke with the expression he used when he was listening carefully, and had already formed a judgment he was not going to share. I looked at Gerald Holt. He had stopped at the edge of the tent. He did not sit. He stood with his briefcase in both hands now, watching Brooke with the patient attention of a man who has learned that waiting costs nothing. Brooke spoke for 4 minutes. She talked about the Parker family the way Sandra had taught her to talk about it, as a legacy, a responsibility, a living thing that required careful stewardship by people who understood its value. She talked about her own life in terms of the family, her career, her connections, her understanding of finance and investment, framing everything as preparation for something larger, as though her Manhattan apartment and her Dartmouth degree had been training for this specific afternoon. She talked about Grandpa Edward with a warmth that was real, I thought, or at least partly real. She did love him, in the way people love the sources of their inheritance, with genuine feeling filtered through self-interest so completely that the two had become indistinguishable. She ended with her glass raised. "To the Parker family," she said, "to what we've built, and to what we'll carry forward." The table raised their glasses. 40 voices, more or less. I lifted my water glass. I touched it to nothing. I drank. Brooke sat down. Sandra put a hand on her arm briefly, a small private gesture of pride and confirmation. This was the moment Sandra had choreographed. This was the overture before the main event. Brooke's audition performed for the benefit of an audience Sandra believed needed to convincing. What Sandra had not understood, across all 30 years of her management of this family, was that the one person who never needed convincing had never once been persuaded by a performance. Grandpa Edward waited until the applause died fully, until the glasses were set back down, until the table settled back into itself, and Brooke had smoothed her dress, and the moment had fully completed its arc. Then he put his hand on his cane and began to rise. The table quieted. This was the real moment. Everyone knew it. Sandra straightened in her chair. Brooke composed her expression into something between anticipation and modesty. Mark stopped refilling his glass. Even the children at the far end of the table seemed to register the change in the air and went still. Grandpa Edward stood. He was 81, and he had been carrying his weight on that cane for 2 years, and he was still the tallest presence in that tent by a quality that had nothing to do with height. He stood, and he looked at the table, all of it, the full length of it, from Mark and Diane at the near end to the empty mahogany chairs in the middle to the yellow plastic chair at the far end. And for a moment he simply looked. Nobody spoke. He reached for the standing microphone. He adjusted it with one hand. He had always been precise about small things, and the soft amplified sound of his breathing filled the tent for a moment before he spoke. "I want to thank Sandra for organizing this," he said. "She works hard for this family." "That is true, and I mean it." Sandra nodded graciously, the nod of a woman accepting what she believes is a preamble. "I want to thank everyone for coming," he continued. "Some of you drove a long way. Some of you flew. I don't take that lightly." He paused. He looked down the table. "I have something to say today that I've been planning to say for 8 months. I planned it carefully because I am 81 years old, and I have learned that the things that matter most deserve to be done carefully." He paused again. I've also learned that the people who matter most deserve to be told directly, in front of the people who need to hear it. The tent was absolutely still. Sandra's smile had not moved. It was fixed now, held in place by the trained muscle memory of a woman who had learned that composure was armor. Grandpa Edward looked down the length of the table, past Mark, past Diane, past the cousins and their children and the empty mahogany chairs. All the way to the end. Allison, he said. My name in that microphone. In that tent. In front of 43 members of the Parker family who had spent my entire life treating me as an afterthought. My name, said by the one man in that family who had always said it like it meant something. Come stand here, he said. I stood. I did not hurry. I pushed my yellow chair back from the table slowly, and I stood to my full height, and I walked the length of the table. The full length, past every face, past Diane's confusion and Mark's frown, and the cousin's uncertain shifting and Brooke's frozen smile, until I reached the head of the table and stood beside my grandfather. He put one hand briefly on my shoulder. Then he looked back at the table. Gerald? He said. Gerald Holt stepped forward from the edge of the tent. He set his briefcase on the corner of the table and opened it with two clean clicks that sounded, in that silence, like something beginning. He removed a document. He set it on the table in front of him. He looked at the family with the calm, uninflected expression of a man who has delivered difficult news many times and has learned to let the facts do the work. Then he looked at Sandra. Her smile had gone. In its place was something I had never seen on Sandra's face in 32 years of watching it. Not anger, not grief, not the sharp, focused fury she used when she wanted to intimidate. Something older than all of those. Something that looked, for just one unguarded moment, like the expression of a person who has just understood that the story they have been living inside was never the story that was actually happening. Her hands were still folded on the table. They were no longer still. Gerald Holt did not clear his throat. He did not say, if I could have everyone's attention, or any of the phrases people use to request what they already have. He simply looked at the document in front of him, then at the table, and began. My name is Gerald Holt, he said. I am the senior estate attorney for the Parker Family Trust, a position I have held for 19 years. I am here today at the request of Edward James Parker, who has asked me to present and confirm the terms of an amendment to his estate plan, executed and notarized on November 14th of last year. He did not look at Sandra when he said this. He did not need to. This amendment supersedes all prior trust distribution frameworks and beneficiary designations associated with the Parker estate. He paused, not for effect, but with the particular stillness of a man who has learned that information lands harder in silence. It is legally binding, fully executed, and has been reviewed and confirmed by the Connecticut Probate Court as consistent with Mr. Parker's capacity and intent. At the time of signing, Mark said, "What?" He said it quietly, more to himself than to the table. The single syllable of a man whose understanding of an afternoon has just been revised without his consent. Diane put her hand on his arm. Sandra did not say anything. She was looking at Gerald with an expression I had never seen before, and hope, honestly, never to see on anyone's face again. The expression of a person watching something they have spent years building disappear in real time, too fast to stop and too complete to argue with. Her hands were flat on the table now. She had unfolded them at some point in the last 30 seconds, and I had not seen it happen. Gerald lifted the document, the Parker estate, in its entirety, is hereby transferred to sole primary beneficiary. He looked up briefly, then back down. Allison Marie Parker, daughter of the late Robert Edward Parker. Upon the death of Edward James Parker, or upon Edward's written election to transfer during his lifetime, whichever occurs first, he set the document down. Mr. Parker has elected to transfer during his lifetime, Gerald said. Effective as of 9 o'clock this morning, the Parker estate, including Parker Manor, 4 commercial properties in Hartford, Connecticut, the Vermont land holding, and all remaining liquid assets held in the Parker Family Trust, is the legal property of Allison Marie Parker, he said, the total valuation, $14.7 million. The number moved through the tent the way a stone moves through still water, a point of impact, then rings spreading outward, reaching the edges in the order they were seated. For 3 full seconds, nobody spoke, nobody moved. The only sound was the oak trees, and somewhere behind the manor, a car on the county road. Then Brooke laughed. It was not the laugh I had heard all afternoon, that warm, carrying, social instrument she deployed so expertly. This was shorter, involuntary, the laugh that escapes before the brain catches it. She pressed her fingers to her mouth immediately after, but it had already happened. A sound that meant, "This cannot be real, Dad." Sandra's voice was careful, measured. She was using her most controlled register, the one she used when she wanted to appear reasonable while feeling nothing like reasonable. "Dad, I think there may be some confusion about." "There is no confusion, Sandra," Grandpa Edward said. His voice through the microphone was quiet and complete, the voice of a man who has made his decision at a great distance from this moment and has no interest in revisiting it now. "Gerald has prepared this over 8 months," he said. "It has been reviewed by the court. It is done. You didn't consult." Sandra stopped herself. She started again. "This is a family matter. This affects everyone at this table. You didn't discuss this with any of us." "It is my estate," Grandpa Edward said. "I don't require a discussion." Sandra looked at me. I had been standing beside my grandfather since he called my name, and I had not spoken. I had let Gerald's words do what Gerald's words were designed to do, and I had kept my face composed and my hands still, and I had looked at the table in front of me rather than at any particular person in it. But when Sandra looked at me, I looked back. For a long moment we simply looked at each other. I thought about the yellow chair. I thought about the dinner at 13, when Brooke told the table about goodwill, and I cut my green beans into small pieces and stared at my plate. I thought about Christmas after Christmas at the wrong end of the table, and the reunion invitations that came with the wrong room assignment, and Sandra's voice on the phone in April, saying "wonderful" in the tone that meant the opposite. I thought about November rain and my grandfather's study, and a manila folder on a clear desk. I did not feel what Sandra expected me to feel looking at her. I had imagined this moment and expected to feel something sharp, triumph maybe, or the particular satisfaction of a correction long overdue. What I actually felt was quieter than that. Something that had been held at a specific tension for a very long time had simply released. I did not smile at her. She looked away first. "Again, this is a fraud," Sandra said. She said it to the table, to Gerald, to the air in front of her. Her voice had lost its control now. Not broken, but cracked, the way a surface looks before it gives. "Edward, you were not, last November you were recovering from your procedure. You were on medication. You were not in a position to, Mrs. Sandra Kellner." Gerald's voice was not loud, but it stopped her. "Mr. Parker's capacity at the time of signing has been fully evaluated and documented by 2 independent physicians and reviewed and confirmed by the Connecticut Probate Court. Any challenge to the amendment on the basis of capacity would require you to contradict the findings of the court and 2 licensed medical professionals." He paused. "I would be happy to provide you with the relevant case number." Sandra's mouth was open. She closed it. "I have copies of all documentation available for any family member who wishes to review them," Gerald continued, in the same even, unhurried voice. "I would also note," and here he opened a second section of his briefcase and removed a smaller folder, "that Mr. Parker has asked me to document and present to the family the record of certain communications made by members of this family to my office regarding the Parker Estate Trust over the past 12 months. He set the smaller folder on the table. "Mrs. Kellner made 9 calls to my office between January and June of this year," he said. "In those calls she inquired on multiple occasions whether modifications to the existing trust framework could be made without Mr. Parker's direct involvement." He looked at the table. "They could not. I informed her of this on each occasion." The table was completely silent. Mark was looking at Sandra. Diane was looking at her hands. The cousins who had been listening with the confused, alarmed attentions of people watching a car accident from a distance were very still. Brooke had not moved since she pressed her fingers to her mouth. She was sitting with her back straight and her champagne glass in front of her, and her face arranged into an expression of careful blankness, the look of someone deciding very quickly what version of themselves to be in the next few minutes. "Furthermore," Gerald said, "Mr. Parker has asked me to note for the family record that a document exists, a photograph, time-stamped this morning, depicting the seating arrangement prepared for Ms. Allison Parker at today's event. This photograph has been added to the estate file as contextual documentation of the circumstances surrounding today's transfer." He closed the folder. "That is the record," he said simply. Grandpa Edward looked at the table one more time. At all of them. At the people he had loved and watched and provided for and been patient with for 81 years. "Allison will be inheriting this estate," he said. "That is settled. What I hope." And here his voice shifted, not softer exactly, but older. carrying something more personal than the legal language that had filled the tent for the past several minutes. What I hope is that this family will find a way to conduct itself with more honesty than it has managed in the recent past. I am 81. I do not have the patience left for pretending not to see what I see. He looked at Sandra for a moment. Just a moment. I see everything, Sandra, he said quietly. I always have. He reached for his cane, and Sandra Kellner, who had run the Parker family for 30 years with the precision and authority of someone who had never once doubted her position, pushed back from the table and stood up so fast, her ivory name card fluttered to the grass. This is not over, she said. Her voice came out wrong, too high, too fast, the voice of someone who has lost the register they rely on and has not yet found another. Grandpa Edward looked at her. Sandra, he said, gently. The gentleness of someone who has no anger left, because the anger has been replaced by something sadder and more final. Sit down. She did not sit down. She turned and walked across the lawn toward the manor, her cream blazer bright in the afternoon light, her steps too fast to be dignified, her hands at her sides. The tent watched her go. Then Mark said something under his breath to Diane. A cousin coughed. Somewhere at the children's end of the table, a toddler, indifferent to history, knocked over a cup of juice and began to cry. I stood beside my grandfather at the head of the table with the document in front of us, and the oak trees moving in the late afternoon wind, and Gerald Holt quietly repacked his briefcase. And the fairy lights in the branches above began, slowly, to flicker on. Golden warm and one by one, like something waking up, Sandra came back out of the manor 11 minutes later. I know it was 11 minutes, because I was standing at the edge of the lawn near the oak trees when she reappeared at the back door. And I looked at my watch when she left, and again when she returned. 11 minutes is enough time to make 2 phone calls and splash water on your face. I suspected she had done both. She had taken off the cream blazer. She was in the white blouse beneath it now, and something about that, the removal of the armor she had put on for this specific afternoon, made her look simultaneously more human and more dangerous. She crossed the stone path with the focused, forward energy of a woman who has made a decision and is not stopping to question it. She was holding her phone. She walked straight to Gerald Holt, who was standing at the corner of the tent speaking quietly with my grandfather. She planted herself in front of him with the authority of someone who has not yet accepted that the authority is gone. I've just spoken with my own attorney, she said. Richard Hale. In New Haven. He says there are grounds to contest this on the basis of undue influence. She said it cleanly, the legal language borrowed and deployed like a weapon she had just been handed. My father is 81 years old. He has been in close contact with Allison over the past year, in a context that excluded the rest of the family. That is a textbook pattern of, Mrs. Kellner. Gerald's voice was patient, the patience of a man who anticipated this specific sentence. Undue influence requires demonstrating that the beneficiary used manipulation or coercion to overcome the testator's free will. You would need to show that Mr. Parker's decision was not his own. He paused. Given that Mr. Parker has provided written documentation of his reasoning, given that 2 independent physicians have certified his capacity, and given that I have 19 years of direct professional experience with Mr. Parker's decision-making process, I would characterize the prospect of a successful undue influence claim as, he paused again, just briefly, remote. Remote is not impossible, Sandra said. No, Gerald agreed. It is not impossible. You are welcome to pursue it. I would note that the legal costs of contesting a fully probated estate amendment are substantial, that the process typically takes between 18 months and 3 years, and that the court record in this matter is, he glanced down at his briefcase, thorough. Sandra stared at him. I'd also note, Gerald said, that Mr. Parker is present lucid and entirely capable of speaking to his own intentions, should any court wish to hear from him directly, Grandpa Edward. Beside Gerald, looked at Sandra with the expression he had used all afternoon, steady, unhurried, already decided. I am right here, Sandra, he said. Something moved across Sandra's face. Not the controlled crack I had seen at the table, something deeper, more structural. She looked at her father the way you look at a place you believed you knew when you realize you did not know it at all, Dad, she said. And the word came out different from all the words that had come before it. Smaller, stripped of the careful management she applied to everything she said is in this family. Just the word. Just his name for her. Dad, I don't understand. Everything I've done, all of it, has been for this family, for you. I have given 30 years. I know you have, he said. Then how? Sandra, he said her name quietly. Final. What you've done for this family and what you've done for yourself have not always been the same thing. You know that. You have always known that. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. I love you, he said. That has not changed and will not change. But love is not the same as agreement, and it is not the same as inheritance, and I think somewhere along the way you confused the three. She closed her mouth. She looked at me then. One last time, a different look from all the previous ones. Not the audit, not the management, not the careful cruelty dressed as concern. Something rawer than any of those. I think she was looking for something to blame that she could name. Some specific thing I had done to take this from her. Some action she could point to. There was nothing to point to. I had driven to Connecticut in November. I had talked about buildings. I had come to Christmas and sat at the wrong end of the table and not complained. I had answered when my grandfather called. That was all I had done. She turned and walked back to the manor. This time she did not come back out. Brooke left 20 minutes later. She did not make a scene. That was not Brooke's way. Scenes were for people who had run out of better options, and Brooke still believed, I think, that better options existed. She said goodbye to a few cousins with the warm, unhurried manner of someone leaving a party early by choice. She hugged Diane. She did not look for me. At the gate she stopped and looked back at the manor, at the stone walls and iron vine fencing and the long gravel drive, with an expression I saw from 30 feet away and will not forget. Not grief exactly, not anger, the expression of someone recalculating, adding up what they had and what they had spent and what the balance was. Then she got in her car and drove through the gates and was gone. Mark stayed. He sat at the mahogany table for another hour with a glass of bourbon and the look of a man trying to determine which version of the afternoon he had actually attended. He was not unkind to me. He never had been. Mark's particular failing was passivity, not cruelty, and now that the structure Sandra had maintained was gone, he seemed genuinely uncertain what his position was or had ever been. At some point he walked over to where I was standing with Grandpa Edward and Daniel, and he extended his hand to me. "Congratulations," he said. He said it with difficulty, the word sitting awkwardly in his mouth. But he said it. "Thank you, Mark," I said. He nodded. He went back to his bourbon. Daniel stood beside me for the rest of the afternoon, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had suspected the movie was different from its trailer and had just been proven right. He did not say much. He refilled my water glass at some point. At another point he looked at the yellow plastic chair still sitting at the far end of the table, abandoned now, and said, "You should keep that." "I might," I said. As the afternoon moved toward evening, the party dissolved. Not dramatically, but naturally, the way gatherings end when the thing everyone came for has already happened. Cars left through the iron gates one by one. The catering staff began breaking down the tents. Margaret came out from the manor with a cardigan for Grandpa Edward, and stood nearby with the alert care she always brought to his presence in the cooling evening air. At 6:15, Gerald Holt shook my hand at the gate. "It has been a pleasure, Miss Parker," he said. "Thank you, Gerald," I said. "For all of it." He nodded once, picked up his briefcase, and got into the black sedan. I watched it move slowly down the gravel drive and through the iron gates and turn onto the county road and disappear. I stood at the gate for a moment in the early evening. The fairy lights in the oak trees were fully on now, gold and warm in the dusk. The lawn was half cleared, the white tents in various stages of collapse, the long mahogany table stripped of its cloth. The yellow plastic chair was still at the far end, sitting on the grass in the fading light, the strip of masking tape still on its back. Allison, I walked over to it. I picked it up. It weighed almost nothing. I carried it to the manor's back step and set it down and stood looking at the lawn, at the oak trees and the fairy lights, and the stone walls going gray in the evening, at Parker Manor filling the space behind me with its solidness, its age, its long and complicated weight. My phone buzzed. My mother. "I answered it, baby," she said. Her voice was full. "Hi, Mom," I said. "Tell me," she said, so I told her. I stood on the back step of Parker Manor, with the yellow plastic chair beside me, and the oak trees lit up in the dusk, and I told my mother everything, and she cried, and I let her, and at some point I was crying too. Not the 4-minute cry in the car in November, but something slower and older than that, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that simply arrives and moves through you and leaves something cleaner in its wake. When I was done, she said, "Your father would have." "I know," I said. "He would have loved this," she said. "I know, Mom." We stayed on the phone without talking for a little while. I looked at the oak trees. She was quiet in Ohio. The evening moved around us both. "Come home soon," she said finally. "I will," I said. I hung up behind me through the manor's back door. I could hear Grandpa Edward's voice saying something to Margaret, low and unhurried, and Margaret's answering laugh, brief and real. I sat down on the back step. I put my hand on the yellow plastic chair beside me. And for the first time in a very long time, I sat at the Parker family home and felt, without qualification, without asterisk, without the low persistent hum of being in a place that had not fully claimed me. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. 6 months after the reunion, I moved into Parker Manor. I did not do it immediately. There were practical reasons for the delay: my lease in Chicago, ongoing projects at Parker Design Group. The logistics of transferring property of that scale, but the honest reason was simpler than any of those. I needed time to let the manor become mine in my mind before I let it become mine in practice. I had spent 32 years knowing that place as somewhere I did not fully belong. That does not reset in a weekend. I gave myself until January. In August, I flew back to Connecticut with a legal pad and spent 4 days walking through every room with a contractor I trusted, a woman named Ruth Chen, who had worked with me on 2 projects in Chicago and had the rare quality of being able to look at a space and see both what it was and what it could be without confusing the two. We moved through the manor room by room, the formal dining room, the study, the guest wing. The kitchen Margaret had kept pristine for 22 years, and I made notes and Ruth made measurements, and we did not talk about what any of it cost, because cost was no longer the variable it had once been. I kept the study exactly as it was. The shelves, the desk, the smell of old paper and lemon oil. I moved nothing. I added one thing, a framed photograph on the corner of the desk, small, taken at Christmas when I was 7. My father and Grandpa Edward standing on the front steps of the manor, both of them squinting into winter sun, my father laughing at something just outside the frame. I put it where Grandpa Edward could see it from his chair. He cried when he saw it. Briefly, the way men of his generation cry, turning slightly away, collecting himself, returning. He did not mention it, neither did I, but after that he spent more time in the study than he had in years, and Margaret told me he had started sleeping better. Sandra filed her contest in September, Richard Hale. Her attorney in New Haven submitted a petition to the Connecticut Probate Court alleging undue influence and questioning Edward Parker's capacity at the time of signing. Gerald Holt responded within 10 days with a document package that was, by his own description, comprehensive. 2 physician certifications, the court's prior review and confirmation, 19 years of documented professional interaction between Gerald and my grandfather. A transcript of the conversation Grandpa Edward had recorded, with Gerald's knowledge and the court's subsequent approval, during the signing of the amendment, in which he stated his reasoning clearly and at length for exactly this contingency. The petition was dismissed in November. 4 months after it was filed, 8 weeks after I moved into the manor, on a Tuesday morning when the Connecticut hills had gone the particular red and orange of late autumn, and the iron gates at the end of the gravel drive were wet with overnight rain, Gerald called me at 9:15. "It's done," he said. "Thank you, Gerald." I said, "Enjoy the manor, Miss Parker," he said. I was standing in the kitchen when he called. Margaret was at the counter making coffee. I set my phone down on the table and looked out the window at the wet iron gates and the red hills beyond them, and Margaret set a cup in front of me without being asked. "Well," she said. "It's done," I said. She made the sound that was not quite a word, the same one she had made in the kitchen the afternoon of the reunion, and went back to the counter. We drank our coffee in comfortable silence. Sandra did not call after the dismissal. She did not write. Through Mark, who had maintained a careful, slightly guilty neutrality since the reunion, I learned that she had moved from her house in Greenwich to a smaller place in Westport. Not a dramatic downsizing, but a real one, the kind that happens when legal fees have been subtracted from a budget that was always partly theoretical. Mark said she was fine. He said it in the tone of someone reporting a weather condition they have no power over. Brooke left her Manhattan apartment in October. The apartment had been leased under an arrangement that had, until November of the previous year, included a contribution from the Parker Family Trust. A fact I had not known until Gerald's documentation revealed it, and which explained certain things about Brooke's lifestyle that had never quite added up. She moved to Philadelphia, where a college friend had offered her a room while she figured out the next thing. I did not know what the next thing was. I did not ask. I thought about Brooke sometimes, In the way you think about someone whose life has intersected with yours at the point of maximum consequence. Not with satisfaction, exactly. With something more complicated, a recognition that the story she had been told about herself, and the story that was actually true, had diverged a long time ago, and that the reunion had simply made the gap visible. I did not wish her harm. I did not wish her anything specific. I hoped she found something real to build. I understood, now more than before, what a difference that makes. My mother came to Connecticut for Christmas. It was the first time she had been inside Parker Manor since my father's funeral, 23 years before. She stood in the front hallway when she arrived and looked up at the staircase and the high ceilings and the winter light coming through the tall windows, and she was quiet for a long moment. "Claire," Grandpa Edward said from the doorway of the sitting room. She looked at him. "Welcome home," he said. She cried. He let her. Then he offered her his arm and walked her to the sitting room where Margaret had set out tea, and they sat together for an hour while I finished making the guest room ready, and through the hallway, I could hear their voices, low, unhurried, the voices of two people who had loved the same man and grieved him separately for 23 years, and were, finally, in the same room. I sat down on the guest room bed for a moment and put my face in my hands, not from sadness. From the specific weight of something long overdue, arriving all at once. By spring, Parker Design Group had relocated its principal operations to Hartford. I kept 2 employees in Chicago. The office there still had active projects, but the firm's center of gravity had moved east to a converted warehouse space in Hartford's Parkville neighborhood that I had found and renovated myself, the way I preferred to do things. We had 7 employees and 2 projects in Connecticut and a third in Massachusetts, and the Architectural Digest piece from the previous spring had generated inquiries that were still arriving 8 months later. I designed a small addition to Parker Manor's East Wing. A studio, 1,200 square feet, with north-facing skylights and concrete floors, and a wall of windows overlooking the back lawn and the oak trees. It was the first structure I had ever designed for myself, without a client, without a brief, without anyone's requirements but my own. I designed it around the oak trees. Grandpa Edward came out to look at it on the day Ruth Chen's crew finished the framing. He stood at the edge of the lawn with his cane and his wool cardigan and looked at the structure for a long time. "Your father would have understood this," he said. "I think so," I said. He looked at the framing for another moment. "He would have had opinions." "He always did," I said. Grandpa Edward laughed. It was a full laugh, unhurried, the laugh of a man who has arrived somewhere he is glad to be. It moved through the spring air and reached the oak trees and came back, changed the way all sounds do when they travel a sufficient distance. I stood beside him on the lawn of Parker Manor and listened to it settle. On the back step of the manor, visible from where we stood, the yellow plastic chair still sat where I had left it the evening of the reunion. I had moved it inside for the winter and back out in March. I had not decided yet what to do with it. Margaret thought I should throw it away. Daniel, who had visited twice since the reunion, said I should mount it on a wall. I thought maybe I would just leave it where it was for now. On the step. In the light. Exactly where it had ended up. Some things you don't need to do anything with. Some things you just let sit, in plain sight where anyone can see them. A reminder not of what was done to you, but of how far the distance is between where you started and where you stand now. I had started in that chair. I stood on the lawn of my home. The oak trees moved in the spring wind, and the framing of my studio cast long shadows across the grass, and Grandpa Edward stood beside me, and the distance between then and now was measurable in every direction. It was enough. It was more than enough. To anyone watching this, if you have ever been handed the smallest seat at the table, if you have ever been made to feel like you were an afterthought in a room full of people who shared your name, I want you to hear this. The people who overlook you are not seeing clearly. They are seeing what they need to see to maintain a story about themselves. That is their limitation, not your worth. You do not need their recognition to build something real. You do not need their invitation to arrive. And you do not need to announce yourself when you finally do. The room will go quiet on its own. If this story moved you, leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. If you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Hit like and subscribe. There are more stories coming, and I think you'll want to be here for them.